So hello and welcome to this Urban Big Data Center free webinar. If you could go ahead and just mute yourself until we start discussion time. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Dr. Emma Seddon, who is a researcher on our Gender Journeys project, who will be speaking about gendered inequalities in STEM, as well as Dr. Phil Mason, who's our research fellow on educational disadvantage in place, who will be speaking a little bit about our IMCD project. So how will this session work? We're going to introduce you broadly to some concepts about impact and triangulation and why we think it's important. We'll do a quick little Slido there to get your thoughts about impact. And then we'll move on to 3 practical examples. The first one, like I said, was IMCD. It's an open data product we have at the Urban Big Data Center. And Phil will talk you a little bit about what it is, how it shows novel data linkages, how it can be used in GIS mapping. And we can tell you a little bit about the Twitter dashboard that's available from it as well. Then we'll move on to example 2, gender journeys or inequalities in STEM. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's been investigated by us or is being investigated by us with secondary data interviews such as motivational interviews and lived experience interviews. Also some fun stuff we did in the Viznet project around digital footprints and social network analysis. And finally, our final example is about social enterprise partnerships. And I'll give the example of food train or food insecurity in older adults and some things we've done there with secondary data surveys and lived experience interviews. But this isn't just a promotional piece of work, although this is my promotional slide. Really, we're going to have an interactive aspect. So we hope at least half of this webinar will be us breaking up into small breakout groups and getting you to think about your own research and how you might orient that for greater impact, say for policy change, or alternatively for something like social media impact. Okay, so we'll contrast the two together. And I think you might have received a note about using Miro. It's okay if you don't know how or you've never done it before. It's just a sticky note brainstorming that will help lead you through for some ideas about how we can make more impactful use of our own research. So who am I? I'm Professor Catherine Lido. I'm a professor of psychology and adult learning in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. I'm also associate director at Urban Big Data Center and deputy director of the Pascal International Observatory in Europe. I'm a social psychologist. These are some of the frameworks that my work has stemmed from, but you can see that whether I'm using social identity or social capital or trying to put it in some sort of urban spatial context, that I'm very interested in novel data, mixed data, and from my research, I'm interested in how we can explore learning inclusion with those different types of data. But Urban Big Data's remit is probably a bit wider than that. It's about promoting the use of data for sure. They've got vast data collections and data services. It's also about teaching and capacity building. So this workshop is part of their remit of trying to offer skills and knowledges around data. And finally, to develop world-leading and impactful urban research. So we'll talk about what exactly we mean by impact in a minute. And if the co-host wouldn't mind keeping an eye on muting people, admitting people and muting people. Thanks, co-host. It's a team player type event. And who's the team? It's the Educational Disadvantage in Place team, of which you can see Phil Mason and Emma's name here on the long list of people who are interested in exploring inequalities, like in educational inequalities, health inequalities, economic sustainability, citizenship, culture. These are all topics that that Urban Big Data Center, but also the Pascal International Observatory are interested in, because we work very closely with Learning Cities networks and UNESCO's Learning City initiatives. which helps us greatly with our impact since UNESCO has a very global reach for the Learning Cities agenda. But I want to ask you all now, if you wouldn't mind, Emma's going to pop in the box the link to Slido. You can head on your web browser to sli.do or slido.com. It's like my last name, but with an S on the front. Pure coincidence, I assure you. And you enter this code. I want to ask you some questions, okay? I want to know, when I say research impact, what does that mean to you? And that should be the first question that you see on the Slido. And if you get stuck, message in the chat box, Emma can help. What does research impact mean? When I say research impact, what does that mean to you? The second question, should funding for tackling social challenges be based on impact? So should we basically allocate funds based on how impactful something is? How important is impact in deciding what we fund and what we don't fund? And three, the third question, how can we best measure or track whether our work is having any real world impact or not? So go ahead and take a minute to answer these questions. And while you do, I'll just share a little bit about what I think impact is, and then I'll hand back over to Emma so we can see what you think impact is. This is how, and I've put the reference for this image in the slides. I like to think about impact as having different levels. So if you work in academia, you'll be very familiar with the red circle here, which is basically our academic impact. And we're measured in this in the ref. We're beaten with this stick when we're considering publications. We used to rank our journals. We still do, but it used to be really important to consider the impact factor of the journal you were publishing in. And then with ref, impact became slightly wider. It became about the ripples of the effects that your work has on the community, which is the black circle there. So it had to do more with whether what you were doing made a difference to people in the community, to people's lives, to say your academic partners or your research partners, your research stakeholders, even your participants. But finally, we have the gray circle there, which is a lot harder to evidence. And that's societal impact. That's addressing inequalities, social justice issues, changing people's lives. And that's where policy impact can really help shift the narrative. And increasingly, policy is directed by what we used to call evidence-based, and now we call evidence-informed. So I'll stop sharing for a minute. Emma, do we have any findings? So I have a little thumbs up if I stop share.
Yeah, so we're just running through the second question, and I'll make the third question live. Unfortunately, you can't have them all live at the same time. So the third one is live now, and I'll just put the link in again. But I can start talking about the first one. Okay, should I share my screen?
Sure, if you want, or you could just talk us through it.
I'll just talk you through because my laptop is not behaving today. So I think that's probably best. So the first question, what does research impact mean to you? We've had some interesting responses. There's a lot of overlap. Mainly the word positive has come up a lot, making positive change, positive difference, change, improving, making a difference. Someone has mentioned the magnitude of research collaboration, contribution. More engagement with public and third sectors, and policy and practice changes. So a lot of talk about change, policy, practical change, positive change, making a difference, which I think is probably a reason a lot of people get into research, particularly social research in the first place. And then the second question, should funding for tackling social challenges be based on impact? So 50% of people have said that this depends on the subject area. Okay. 17% it depends on the funder, and then an equal split, 17% say yes and 17% say no. So quite a diverse range of opinions there, and that's something we will be able to chat about later on, particularly which subject areas people think it should or shouldn't be taken into account. And I'll just see what we've got with the third question. So how can we best measure or track real-world impact over time? Citation metrics, which a lot of academics will of course be familiar with. Social media is another one. I suppose that would be things like the number of followers and the amount of engagement you get on social media. And then we've also got someone who said, depends on what you're trying to measure, which is a very good point. We didn't say. So again, that's something that we'll be able to discuss later. And I've just had another one, statistics, stakeholder community feedback, policy change and implementation. So yeah, I suppose there are different.
That's a good answer.
That's a lot, yeah.
Last one again.
So statistics, stakeholder community feedback, and lastly, policy change and implementation.
Great. I think you've just summed up our presentation. We can probably stop now.
Yeah.
Let's go home. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. We'll use that to make a little word cloud, and we'll post that word cloud when we post the recording for this video on the UBDC website. So if I can just share my screen again.
If I could just say, sorry, Catherine, before you carry on, that if people want to ask questions, they can put them in the chat, but also on the Slido. So there's a Q&A bit there as well. If you want the question to be anonymous, for example, you can post it on there.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. So you can see that impact is a tricky, nefarious thing. It's defined in very different ways, and it's certainly assessed in different ways. I apologize for the sound of my dogs. But today we'll be talking a little bit about how we can create research that is impactful by using multiple types of data, innovative data, novel data, and triangulating it. That is something that we're very interested in at Urban Big Data Center. So most of us are familiar with qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative words, quantitative numbers, and never the twain shall meet. When I was trained as a social psychologist did numbers and surveys, sociologists did words, and we were in the same department at Sussex, and we used to fight a lot. But what we're finding now as we get into more novel types of data, for instance, big data, we see that when data becomes quite naturalistic, when it is social media data, for instance, when it is even population data, you can start to play with it and look for patterns. And that's at the bottom, symphonic social science, which is John Halford's concept. You basically can start looking for patterns emerging within data, patterns within patterns, and it starts to become almost like art. And I think this is quite an interesting blurring of the lines when we start to look at natural data that's in our environment, which Urban Big Data Center does a lot of. It looks at traffic flows, traffic cameras, cycling data, mobile phone data, social media data. It becomes quite fuzzy because you can often quantify it, but you can also discuss it qualitatively as experience, as a day in the life of people. So Phil will talk us through a very practical applied example of that, but here's just a quote from a publication I had with Mike Osborne a few years ago. Sorry. Big data may be numerically large or beyond the capacity of most relational database systems to manage. More significantly, it may be continuous in real time with ongoing data collection, or it may be big due to the complexity of the data themselves and the need for novel methods to capture, analyze, interpret, and visualize. Data sets are becoming bigger and more open, and it's important to tap into such resources to improve our knowledge of citywide, not sure the last word there because I can't see it, but you get the idea that increasingly we're no longer talking about a small survey with a certain number of people and a small number of interviews with a certain number of people. We're starting to, we still use those very tried and trusted methods, but we can now couch them in existing data in different types of novel data. So what do I mean then by triangulation? If we're triangulating different, I like to call them data strands. I think of it like weaving together the different data into a brain, okay? So triangulation is really about asking the same question using sometimes a different disciplinary perspective, usually a different paradigm, and a different data set. But you're asking the same question and you're coming at it from a different angle. So if you can yield a similar or a very different answer, that's the process of triangulation. So mixed methodology you'll see here is usually very different paradigms. So for instance, quantitative with qualitative, experimental with experiential, surveys and interviews, those are mixed methods. Multi-methods are within a single paradigm. So let's say I was using a dominantly qualitative approach. I could still be using different types of qualitative. I could be using a discursive approach or a critical approach alongside phenomenological lived experience approach. That is multi-methods. Either way, my experience is not the best way to achieve successful triangulation is not for myself to try to be the jack of all trades, but to try and partner with researchers who are very different from me. And in this sense, we can use this little image at the bottom. We can use different methods with different theories, different paradigms, different perspectives, but asking the same question. And that for me is the essence of triangulation. So I'll take a little pause for breath here while I hand over to Phil, who will give us a really practical example of what this looks like in practice.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. So, okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the IMCD project, which stands for the Integrated Multimedia City Data Project. And this is, I think this is one of the Urban Big Data Centre's long-running successes. It's been a very productive project, and it's sparked a lot of interest outside UBDC. So it was set up in 2015 with a brief to address themes of urban living. And looking back at the original conception, I realized that there are 15 urban research themes that were originally conceived of to be dealt with by this quite large and I think sprawling probably isn't the correct word, but diverse project. So it's based on studying the Greater Glasgow region, which makes up about 1.2 million people. So that's Glasgow City itself and the 7 other neighbouring local authorities. And the idea of it is to integrate multi-mode data. So we've got mixed methods, multi-methods now, multi-mode data. So the core of it is a set of data sets based on personal level data. So self-reported data and data that's obtained objectively by wearing sensors. And there are also, you can bring in and link other external data sources to produce innovative combinations of data. Now, when I first came into big data, I thought big data just meant lots more data than usual. So I was a bit surprised when I came across the IMCD project, because its core personal level data set is it's a household survey of about just over 2,000 people, which I thought, well, it's okay, it's not that big. But as I became to discover more about big data, I realized, of course, as Catherine said, with the 3 V's, or in actual fact, I discovered about 7 V's of big data. There are probably more now. It's like fundamental particles in physics. Anyway, so it's not so much a question of the volume of data in these person level data sets, so much as the variety of them, the ways in which they're collected, and what you can do with them to produce innovative combinations of linkable data sets. So as I said, there were about 15 urban research themes originally conceived. In our slightly more constrained set of interests in education research, we're interested ourselves in sort of attitudes, literacies and behaviours. So these relate to education and skills and moving into employment, sustainability, and energy use, transport, engagement in cultural life and civic activity, and technology use, ICT and things. So let me explain a little bit more about the nature of the person level data sets. Here's a nice little colourful thing. So we start off with the core of this household survey of, let's say, just over 2,000 people from 1,500 households. So this survey was set up as a random stratified sample across these 8 local authorities in the west of Scotland. And it was a standard face-to-face interview type survey. Now, a subset of those people, well, everyone who took the survey was asked to fill in a travel diary. So that was for one day, the day before they did the household survey. People were asked to make fill in a diary of any travel they'd done that day before. So the origin and destination of their journeys, the time they'd started and finished the journey, whether it was what the sort of mode of transport, whether it was walking, cycling, going by car, what have you, and the purpose of the journey. So there's a day's data for most people, about 3/4 of the people, about how they've moved around their neighbourhood or city. There are about 1/4 of people who didn't travel at all, so they don't feature in that travel diary. A further subset we collected data sort of objectively, as I say, by using worn devices. There's GPS tracking with 333 people. Let me see. So these are worn devices. So these were worn for between 2 to 11 days, and every 5 seconds of that time, the GPS coordinates were recorded. And when the data were cleaned up and analysed, it's possible to classify these, classify the patterns in terms of the travel modes that people have used. An even smaller subset filled in an activity diary, so back to self-reporting. So they was reporting what things they'd done during a single day, whether it was social stuff or recreational or work or what have you. And then an even smaller group still happily donned another fiendish device, a life logging device, which is primarily, I think, in terms of the data we've looked at, it captures images every 5 seconds of the day over a period of a couple of days. It also collects information on motion, temperature, and what have you. But it's very, very detailed information, which can be switched off, I believe, at moments when it's not appropriate to have photographs taken. You'll be relieved to hear. Okay, so that's the context of the personal level data, but it exists within a broader landscape where we can bring in external data from elsewhere. One of the things we have is 64 million tweets, geocoded tweets taken during the period when the survey was done, which was, I forgot to mention, that was, I think, July or May to November 2015, around about that, so it's about 6 months. But one of the things that we've done, and the things I've been particularly interested in myself, are sort of bolting on, linking secondary and administrative data to the household survey and travel diary data, for example. So the obvious things that we're interested in educational disadvantage and place, as you might imagine, is neighbourhood deprivation. So we've linked the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation quintiles and deciles to our individual people based through their data zone in which they live. Another thing that particularly interests us at the moment is the effect of green space. And we've managed to, one of our data scientists helped us to get a data set based on the Ordnance Survey Open Green Space data set and the Open Street Map data sets and he calculated the isochrone. So basically where a person lives is within a 10-minute walk to an access point to a type of green space. We can classify that green space into various types, like parks and gardens, sporting grounds, children's play areas, and the like. So we did a year or so ago. We were doing a little paper on. It's quite a big paper in the end. This is on city information modelling. So that's to put it in an even broader context. And we were considering three things: the level of learning engagement, walking behaviour, and proximity to green space. So we're considering learning in the sort of UNESCO life-wide learning cities context of formal, non-formal, and informal education. So formal is where you're studying to get a qualification. Non-formal is where you're studying something that someone else has dreamed up, but it's not for a qualification. Then there's informal education, which is something you do off your own bat. So you decided to learn French, or in the last 18 months, of course, we've all learned how to make sourdough bread. That kind of informal learning. We got deprivation, as I say, measured in terms of the SIMD quintiles, and the green space access if you're within 10 minutes walk of a green space or not. So it's a dichotomous variable. So we tried to understand these complex patterns relating to behaviours and attitudes that were in the household survey, particularly about learning engagement. This is so whether or not you've done those three types of learning or any one of them in the last 12 months. So what we found out from looking simply at the household survey and the green space data is that learning engagement is you're more likely to be learning engaged if you live near a green space, any sort of green space. So it's depending on the type of learning engagement, it's about 1.27 to twice the odds of being learning engaged. But we then looked at this by combining three of our data sources: the household survey, the travel diary, and the GPS tracks. And in this one, we found that learning engaged people generally walk more often. So compared with not walking at all, 0 days a week, and 5 to 7 days a week, most days of the week, then you're more likely to be learning engaged by a factor of 1.7 if you walk every day or five or more days a week. People who are learning engaged also walk for longer. The amount of walking people do that's emerged from this survey is that they don't actually walk that much, but even so, there is a significant difference of about 5 minutes between the learning engaged people and non-learning engaged people across all the ages. So that's walking anywhere. As I say, we have a particular interest in the effects of green space, the influence of green space on learning and more broadly on mental health, for example. But in this particular analysis, partly because the amount of time people spend walking in green space is pretty small, we couldn't find any significant differences between the two. So the final aspect I want to mention today, we've done quite a lot more, but there isn't time to go through it all. Just giving you a few of our greatest hits, as it were. We looked at, from a more qualitative point of view, we looked at actually where and what people are doing moving around the city by looking at the GPS tracks. So this is, as I say, it's a more qualitative illustration. And it emerges from this, if I have the next slide, Catherine. If you look on the left, we've got the patterns of the learning engaged older women, and on the right, it's non-learning engaged. So this is a composite set of their tracks in orange for the learning engaged women and in blue for the non-learning engaged women. And there's a suggestion here. As a statistician, I obviously I find this difficult, but as a qualitative student of the qualitative arts, I can look at this and I can defocus a bit, and I think, well, looking at these, maybe there's a suggestion here that learning engaged older women are walking less in green space and more in the city centre than non-learning engaged women. And that, to me, is a slightly counterintuitive result or an impression, and it goes against what I would expect. So I think that's what I want to end with here, is the idea that by looking at the same thing from a different angle, triangulation, we can find apparently contradictory results, but they aren't contradictory. They're all true. But we have to find a way through our triangulation of finding an accommodation with these apparently contradictory results. So part of this is all obviously about impact. And here's just a little illustration of some earlier work that Catherine did. And it's illustrating here a 24-hour period of the pathways of people walking around the city of Glasgow. That's very pretty.
Thanks so much, Phil. So I think Phil's done a really great job of showing a project which has triangulation at the heart of its design, of how it was developed, of the types of data it wanted to capture, although it was an unusual task in that it was an open data product. So it was really collected for other people to use. And so as Phil's shown sort of one aspect of its use, this visualization shows another, which is gendered patterns around the city. Here's another use that we had as well. We were very lucky to take it out into IKEA. I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a strange place to bring your research. But we were able to pull some of the inequalities in different types of literacies that we measured in the survey. For instance, not just reading and maths, but financial literacy, eco-literacy, health literacy. And we visualized those with a map of Glasgow. And we brought it out into IKEA, and the kids made these lovely little badges here, which they could put it together: reading literacy, cultural literacy, eco-literacy, foreign language literacy. And we could have a nice conversation with the parents around this. We brought it into schools, we brought it into community centers. So it shows that it's not just about the data, it's about the journey and the story that you're telling, which brings me to our next story, which will be Emma sharing a little bit about some of our other projects about gendered inequalities in STEM.
Yes, hi. I'm going to talk briefly about the Gender Journeys project. This is an international interdisciplinary project that explores the impact of gender on the experiences of STEM students and graduates as they make their way through higher education and onto employment in the UK, India, and Rwanda. We wanted to explore this because there remain persistent gender inequalities in STEM across the world, and particularly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. On the whole, as you might be aware, these subjects and areas of employment tend to be very male-dominated. And of course, there are intersectional elements to this related to class and race, among other things that we will also be exploring. So to explore all of this, we are taking a mixed methods approach, and we will be combining a large-scale survey, which will be done in India and Rwanda and the UK, all three contexts, with STEM students. We'll be combining that with secondary data analysis. So in the UK, we have the HESA data, the Higher Education Statistics Authority. This is administrative student level data of undergraduates, all students in fact, and we'll be finding the equivalents in India and Rwanda where we can. So we have this big data, quantitative data on the one hand, and we'll be combining that with qualitative data, including interviews and focus groups with STEM students and graduates in India and Rwanda. So we're mixing scales, levels of data, allowing for triangulation, as Catherine and Phil have described. And this means we can talk about large scale phenomena or trends that we're able to observe, as well as then individual experience. So we can look at experiences in STEM on that qualitative level, what barriers and facilitators people have experienced. We can look at personal socioeconomic background. So for example, the impact of having a family member, a parent particularly, who has already studied STEM themselves. We can also look at the impact of education on motivations and the confidence in maths and how that impacts these kinds of things. So we can look at how all of these things impact experience on that individual level, as well as a sense of belonging within STEM environments, the likelihood of dropping out of STEM higher education or later dropping out of a STEM career at those individual and then these larger group demographic kind of population levels as well. So because of the sort of interdisciplinary and international scope of this project, we have stakeholders in various institutions and countries, of course. So this enables us to collect these different types of data, bringing a richness to our analysis, but it also brings multiple impact opportunities within those different organizations, including universities, public and private STEM employers, and maybe further down the line, primary and secondary schools and even state level organizations. So we have the potential here for global impact as well, with contributions to national policy development in each country and possibly other countries across the world. A key strategy for this is the development of a gender sensitive toolkit, which will be made available to students, universities, employers, and we will also get this out to policymakers in the 3 countries. And this toolkit would focus on how to attract girls and women into STEM subjects and how to keep them in the field, as well as, of course, other intersectional elements that we find along the way. So this would contribute to initiatives at various levels of education and employment to get more underrepresented groups into STEM and to keep them there. And it also has the possible wider impact of contributing to sustainable development goals. I've listed some of the SDGs there on the slide, mainly related to education, gender equality, innovation and employment, all of which play a key role in developing sustainable, equitable economies. So we're in the process of collecting the data right now. So these bigger policy-focused impact activities are in the pipeline. Instead, I'm going to focus on some media engagement that we've been doing so far. So Catherine, if you could go to the next slide. There we go. So firstly, we have built and are continuing to build networks of academic and non-academic stakeholders. So within the project, for example, we have research advisory boards in India and Rwanda. This connects us with other institutions, other academics working in this field, creating more connections. And this will be useful for for getting advice on, for example, developing our data collection instruments, but also when we come to disseminating the toolkit, disseminating the survey, building these connections early has already proved really useful. Building non-academic networks and communities takes a little bit more thought, and this is where we go to social media and the internet. So we've started outreach work to create networks of people who are themselves studying and working in STEM, connecting them with one another and of course with the project as well. So for example, we have a website there on the bottom left of the slide, a website that we update with our events, with blog posts and any publications. And we're also active on Twitter, and we tweet about anything related to STEM, particularly opportunities for underrepresented groups, maybe internships, things like that, and any research findings from other projects or any news items related to gender and STEM that might be relevant to our audience. We have also run events that are not academically focused, such as happy hours. And again, back to the bottom left of the slide, an evening with Angela Saini, that was one of our happy hours, which was with the author, Angela Saini, who wrote the book Inferior, that you might have heard of. In that book, she explores sexism within scientific research and how that then goes on to influence social beliefs. So as you can imagine, that is not just of interest to academics, but also people working within science already and others. We have another event coming up taking place prior to COP26, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and we're going to be talking about gender and sustainability. We've sort of subtitled this, why the world needs more female scientists. And we're going to be looking at how gender, STEM, the climate crisis, and other inequalities are being tackled in India, Rwanda, and Nepal. So this relates to the project, but it reaches out beyond it, enabling us to get in touch with more people, again, to continue to build those communities online. And lastly, we will be writing a piece for The Conversation when we have our findings. If you haven't heard of it already, The Conversation is a news website that publishes pieces written by academics. So we've already been speaking with the editors of The Conversation, and this will be a great way to get our findings out to a wider audience beyond academics. And of course, this is much faster than an academic journal, which can take a long time, although we will of course be publishing there as well. But this piece will be able to get out there much more quickly. And once we have this piece written, we will make sure the university's press office is aware so that it can then be circulated through those university networks. So even though we don't actually have any findings to report yet, we've already begun to build these networks to get the project name and logo, which you'll see here on the slide, out online. So we're setting up this infrastructure, which will be invaluable when we do have findings, when we have our toolkit, and when we can start to make those bigger policy focused impacts already. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Emma. So I think in the first example, we saw a really great example of triangulation at the heart of research design. And I think in that example that Emma's just shared, we've seen a really excellent impact and engagement agenda at multi-levels at the heart of the design. I just wanted to share, it's still the same part of the example, but we are just finishing a successful gender inequalities initiative called Viznet, which is part of the EPSRC's funded projects Inequalities Matter. And it was basically to address gendered inequalities specifically in early career academia, women in engineering and computer science at the who are postdocs essentially. So we had 30 women, so you're looking now at a very small cohort who engaged longitudinally over actually nearly 2 years in various in situ support in virtual networking. And this was before COVID. So we were one of the first to have set up a Teams, to have piloted virtual conference attendance, to have collaborative networking events for women. And so we did a number of initiatives to address the issue on the bottom image there of, you can see that basically the narrowing of the pipeline as women climb the ladder of academia. And so we've evidenced there on the bottom bar graph that you can see the digital footprint of our cohort went up from time 1 to time 2, pre and post Viznet participation in Twitter and LinkedIn, in all kinds of online metrics. And we're writing that up as a paper. However, probably more pertinent to this, when COVID did hit, we were able to provide evidence, written evidence for Parliament. It basically saying that equalities were worsening, and also a piece for Nature Index about why inclusion is more important than ever and why COVID should be an opportunity rather than a barrier for tackling gendered inequalities that were getting worse because of homeschool, that were getting worse when everybody was forced to go home, and people with caretaking responsibilities were disproportionately affected. And we teamed up with Evidence Base, who helped us review the funding landscape to show that actually the funding inequalities also got worse during COVID. So I don't know why I ended with the social networks here, but it was just to show that sometimes a visualization is worth 1,000 words. You can see that the professional networks over time displaying different issues, like over-reliance on one's manager for networks. That's the one on the top left there. And you can see that we can try to take it from being clustered around one person and spread it out. Likewise, the second one being too lab-based clustered, we can diversify the networks through strategically helping women think about the ways that we network. And promoting them to reach out and network outside their management and lab-based structures. So this is something that we, like I said, we have written up as documented parliamentary evidence, and also in Nature Index, which has a huge scientific reach. So our third and final example, sorry if 3 examples is too much, but we had more. These are 3 different case studies, if you will, about different ways to have impact. And the third one, I think, has been probably my most successful to date in terms of actual policy change. So this is a partnership project. You can see the partners down the right-hand side. It's funded by the National Community Lottery Fund. It is in collaboration with the Social Enterprise Food Train and the umbrella project Eat Well, Age Well. We approached this very much with an ethical, inclusive, and kind mixed methods methodology. We were working with potentially vulnerable older adults facing food poverty and food insecurity. So we knew that we needed to really be researching with and not on people. So during this research, we very much reached out into the community. We went to 41 different research sites, which included day centers, lunch clubs, food train service users, and we did also end up doing some postal surveys as well for people in hard to reach rural areas. So we really wanted to look at varying levels. We've looked at national nutritional information on healthy aging, on healthy nutrition, but we went right down to qualitative interviews as well. So this is just some results from our survey. You can see we had average age nearly 80 of our participants, and 169 total older folk in Scotland who took part, with 17 in-depth interviews. And really, we wanted to show that there was a holistic picture, that it wasn't just about malnourishment or undernourishment, that it was a cycle of the relationship between malnutrition, or in this case undernutrition, being related to social isolation and well-being. And that's exactly what we found. We found that poor well-being was associated with greater loneliness, less social support, and that was associated indeed with feeling more food insecure and being at risk of undernutrition. Risks of undernutrition for older folk include rapid recent weight loss, family concern over weight loss, rings becoming looser. So we had very practical measures, but we also measured the weight, the height and weight, and have the BMI of all of our participants. So there was a lot of thought that went into it. There was a lot of signposting for onward support. And we were particularly interested in the people who were in receipt of food support services and those who were in the community. So I'm not here to show you necessarily the findings of that. You can access, we have an open source paper online. And by the way, in these slides, which you'll receive afterwards, has links to all of these academic outputs, policy papers, and blogs are in the footnotes. But it was just interesting that the qualitative findings really helped bring alive this message, because what we found was a story of social eating, basically. That it wasn't actually about finances, it wasn't about economics, it wasn't even about food banks. Partly that was the story, partly it was about the changing nature of the high street as well. You know, you've lost your local shop, you don't recognize how the aisles are set up. So there was a physical barriers, there were financial barriers, but there was this huge thing around whether food was perceived to be still enjoyable or not. And that was very much tied into a sense of isolation and loss. So here's 2 quotes. It was different when my husband was alive. Sorry, I'm not Scottish. I like to be said, well, I've enjoyed that, you know, if you cook something, but now it doesn't matter. Or this spiral of, I can't be bothered eating just for me. and there'll be nobody coming round, so I don't need to cook for anyone else. So we found financial barriers not as prominent as both the personal, social isolation, but also the structural, societal issues. So now where I live, we've had both a butcher and a fish shop close. And this is due to get worse again with COVID. We did this pre-COVID. And the last one, people have been very good, but it can be a thing. And anxiety sometimes, you know, I've not got the energy to go across town and get some messages. And again, with COVID, we have a actual greater barrier to leaving the house for older folk. So we came up with this cycle of food insecurity and malnutrition risk, and we were super lucky to be asked to provide evidence because Scotland's considering enshrining the right to food into law. So we hosted a parliamentary event where we were able to invite MSPs to speak to the issue, to provide our evidence in greater detail. And I can provide you the video to that webinar link. So this has turned out to be something which has a great social media presence as well. So you can follow Eat Well, Age Well online. You can follow Food Train online. You can look at how policy and practice around food as a human right and undernutrition as an unseen killer in older adults is now really a topical issue. So what can we learn from all three of these examples? And then we'll break up for you to think about how you can apply this maybe to your own work. Number one, in each of these examples, you can see that we're really about telling the story of the data. So it's about asking the questions in different ways and trying to bring it together for a really good data story, if you like. So for instance, in Food Train, when COVID hit, we were able to very rapidly take messages from this, and likewise in Viznet, take messages from our findings for the pandemic. You know, what are some short, sharp lessons we have here about food insecurity? And we know it's about isolation. Okay, we need to promote the befriending scheme. And they moved rapidly from in-person befriending to phone befriending. And meal sharing, how can meal making and meal sharing take off in the pandemic safely? So these are, how can we do groceries delivery? How can we roll that out on a more massive scale? How can we use that impact to apply for future funding and expansion of Food Train? Because right now it's only in 8 local authorities in Scotland. How can it help us redefine the conversation, redefine the discourse? And it really has helped do that. It's really helped us talk about malnutrition risk, not in terms of food banks, but in terms of social concepts and in terms of that losing weight is not a natural part of the aging process. It is a warning signal for physical and mental health issues. It helped us argue for increasing support. It helped us also to reach out and engage with different stakeholders. We took our findings back to our older folk. We had afternoon teas. We had a ukulele band there. We were able to tell the story with them and see if it really rang true. But we were also able to have a more academic conference where we invited MSPs to speak, journalists, aging groups like Age UK. So increase support, increase your networks, like Emma was saying, to get the word out. So we really need to think at the start of these projects, it's not enough anymore to say, and then we had a report. It's really thinking about different levels of impact with different stakeholders and how for some, you know, creating a film, which you could then show in schools, in parliament, in different aspects will work. How can I triangulate the data and make the most of the visualizations for a policy paper versus what we're doing here now, a webinar, which are increasingly impactful. So I've put some little asterisks there to show the specific Food Train examples of these types of engagement and outreach, but you might, you know, want to use them to develop your own. We had at the conference for multi-stakeholders, we had a cartoonist making visual minutes there. We had an older adult panel. So we had a whole panel of older folk talking about, you know, the policy that was being debated and what it meant to them, what it meant to their lives. And oops, excuse me. And there is there's just a screen capture from the piece that we wrote for Policy Scotland, which had the link to the event and the webinar recording. And you can see then people go to parliamentary events and it's there in perpetua. It's there forever, essentially, or at least until they wipe their Policy Scotland archives. So just wrapping up then, we're wrapping up the I speak at you, you listen part. Data lessons that I've learned. Consider novel and innovative data, consider existing data, consider quantitative and qualitative data archives, for instance. UKDS has qualitative data is increasingly made open. I think we have a duty to make use of data that's already been collected, because that's taxpayer money if it's UKRI research, and somebody might have already looked at that issue. Even if it's not with your population, it's a really great place to start. Consider also increasingly social media and naturally occurring data. Of course, there's ethics to this. There's ethics to everything that Phil was talking about with the life logging camera images, but sometimes it's worth going through the ethical hoops in order to use more creative methodologies. Think about blurring the boundaries. So don't just think about I had a survey and I had a qualitative. Think about how they work together. Are they sequential? Are they parallel? Do they feed into each other in an iterative way? Or do you actually use arts-based methods to blur the line? Think about closing the loop. Can I get from numbers to a holistic story, or can I get from a lived experience to a national level data story? So triangulation, interdisciplinarity, and diverse impact and knowledge exchange activities are all something to think about in your work. Increasingly for PhDs, I've had this conversation, I know one of my PhDs is here, Zai. Increasingly for PhDs, we're more interested in impactful work than necessarily a good journal article output. So if you can show that you're taking your work out into communities, out to university stakeholders and trying to change things, that is a really powerful indicator of the success of your PhD work. But yes, we know that there's definite privacy tensions. We've got the open data science framework, which tells us that good practice is to make sure that your data is archived, your data is open and accessible. However, you might be working with vulnerable populations and there might be privacy tensions there about risks of disclosure and being GDPR compliant. So we know that this is a simplistic way of looking at the world, but we do need people to want to engage, to feel heard. If we want the policymakers to hear, though, we also need to learn to speak policymaker language. So we need people to want to be heard and to engage with policy. We need policymakers to want to listen to our story. And like it or not, policymakers like numbers. They like big data, but they don't just want numbers. You know, they like stories. So how can we integrate those together to make a good message? So I'm not going to read this slide, but I did actually put a lot of thought into it. So this is one when you watch it back to think about later. When you as a researcher are entering the world of impact, if you're entering the world of policy change, first you need to think about why. What are your motivations here? Is it social justice? Is it policy change? Is it hard to reach populations? Have a look at what's being debated, what's in the press, what's in politics. Are there organizations who are already involved in here? Reach out to them, put yourself forward, even if it means, you know, voluntary internship, you know, make those links, because connecting is key to all of these examples that we have here. None of these are done by a single researcher alone. Then, if you do want to make policy change, look at what's lacking already in the evidence out there. Look at the skills that are lacking. So one way to do this, if you jump down, is to engage with the SPICE team here in Scotland. They're the Scottish parliamentary, basically they're the people who link academics to policymakers to try and fill that evidence gap. So that's one way, but you can also just literally reach out to MPs and MSPs who are interested in your particular issues. Think carefully about the types of events that will draw people in. Here in Scotland, you can do lunchtime events. So you can invite MSPs, you can get a glossy thing into their real inbox or their virtual inbox and come along for a lunch discussion. You can have evening events, which I know we've held one for unseen disabilities, and all kinds of different things. But think, how can I invite people? How can I reach into communities, but how can I invite people into my work as well? And then you want to think very differently for public dissemination. You want to look at the public discourses. Are there competing discourses? Is there disinformation? What are the main outlets for getting this out here? Even if it's social media, it's a very different outlet on Instagram to Twitter to TikTok, for instance. You see academics increasingly on TikTok, and think about what is the best venue for that. Tag people in, though the same thing about connecting and making links matters for social media. Thinking also about engaging journalists. Academics tend to view journalists with skepticism. Emma talked about the conversation, but I think you can have really, the BBC are looking for news stories. So if you can learn to communicate in a simple 3 key messages type of way, but get some training. There's social media training, there's regular media training, get media savvy, use user-friendly language, and you can actually make a lot more of your work if you put some thought into this aspect of who do I want to communicate with and how can I change the narrative. So that comes to the end of the we speak at you listen part, and we're a little bit over what I had hoped, but we still have a good half an hour to engage in our next activity. So Emma, do you want to just say a little bit about what we're going to do? We're going to head over to the head into breakout rooms and head over to the Miro board to discuss these 2 questions. So I hand over to Emma.
Yeah, so I've just posted the link there to the Miro board, and are we going to go into 3 breakout rooms? So we'll go into 3, and the number of your breakout room is the part of the board you need to zoom in on. So we have breakout room 1, which has got a green background, breakout room 2 is orange, and breakout room 3 is yellow. So on the Miro board, there are questions, one related to policy and research, and then the other to social media and research. And we're going to talk through those questions, and you can add post-it notes to the Miro board if you would like. Otherwise, we'll be adding things there to get some ideas down and just have a chat about it.
Great. Emma, have you put the link to the Miro board in the chat? I'm sure you have. Okay, great. So I see we've lost a few people, and that's fine. Interactive's not for everyone, but there's no, I should have said there's no pressure to have registered for Miro, because we can do the sticky notes for you, or you can join with us. I'll just send everybody to breakout rooms now. And Phil or Emma, could you copy those questions into the chat just so we have them as well? All righty. So 3 breakout rooms coming up, and then we'll talk about how we can orient our own research for these different audiences. So welcome back, participants. I think a few people might still be joining back, but thank you all so much for our fun activity. I'm gonna ask each group to just maybe pick a person to share back briefly, but what we can do is we'll have Emma tidy up our little boards, and what we can do is when you're finished, when we're done, I'll make sure that we'll email all attendees a copy of the slides, a lovely screen capture of our board, and a recording of this session so that you can go back over and have a think about what we've discussed. But can I just ask, we ended up only having 2 groups in the end, didn't we? I thought we had 3, but maybe I could ask for a volunteer from Emma and Phil's group. Do you want it to be Emma or Phil or somebody else?
Yeah, so we mostly focused on the policy question, and we got into a really interesting discussion about the tension between wanting to create change, but then resistance to that change because of how fixed structures are within, for example, within education, within institutions like universities. So how do you get people to engage and challenge their perceptions of what might work? And that can even be people who are vulnerable, who you're trying to help. We didn't really come up with a solution, but we spoke a lot about engaging with lay people, using a kind of vocabulary that is not academic, is not jargony, combining stories and numbers, going slow and steady, and making sure that in the first instance your research is relevant and engaging with all stakeholders from the beginning. And we very, very briefly spoke about social media, and the main question was, does it actually work? Does Twitter actually do anything? So yeah, that was sort of where we got to there, really.
Thank you very much. I think we had much more practical discussion. This sounds like you got quite philosophical there, but brilliant. Would anybody from our group like to feedback? I think you've heard enough of me. So does anybody want to feedback a little bit on some of the post-it notes, either from social media or policy?
Sure, I'll jump in. So
which one do you want to feedback on, Brittany?
Well, I mean, funnily enough, a lot of our answers they overlapped quite a bit for both question 1 and question 2. But for social media, we focused a lot on like the importance of an image as well as a hashtag that draws people in. Also, links that people could click through to get them to more interactive bits about the research. If I could just jump over to question 1, we have like the overlap with having infographics or images that are going to pull people in, a way for people to easily digest information quickly and what will get them interested in reading more about the research. And then also for question 1, making sure that there are numbers that accompany the words, because at the end of the day, policymakers do want to see what they would feel is much more concrete evidence of things. And so making sure that we include statistics and the numbers to accompany the words.
Great. Did anyone else from the group want to jump in? Anything we missed?
That's a fair summary. A good overlap between how you appeal to people on social media and how you appeal to people of Parliament. The one thing I would add that I found when I've read policy briefs is this emphasis they all seem to have on when a goal can be achieved, or what sort of interim goals have they put in place for this to happen. And they have a lot of metrics to measure when how far they've got, how much progress they've got left to go. And I think that can be quite attractive to somebody from a policy standpoint, because they know what they're, aiming towards.
Yeah, I like that. You said, think about what you want to change, think about the timeline for change, think about the key players in that change, which was quite simple. So wonderful. Well, believe it or not, we're bang on time. I feel like we could have discussed a lot more, but what I will do is I'll leave the call open for question and answers, and I'll hang on here to answer some questions. But I'm going to stop the recording. And like I said, I'll make sure that Rhiannon emails you all the slides, the recording, and our lovely little, is it Menti board? I forgot the name of it. What is it, Emma? Miro board, the lovely Miro board that you've all created. But we're very contactable. So the final slide that I'm no longer screen sharing is basically a slide for getting in contact with Urban Big Data Center. The web links there. You can access our data. We've got so many different types of data. You can access the skills training videos for all of our skills and capacity building events, or you can just get in touch and tell us about your work. So thank you all so much for coming, and we look forward to engaging with you in future.